Welcome to Theology for the People. My name is Nick Cady, and the purpose of this podcast is to bring theological topics and discussions to you in a way that's accessible and understandable. On this episode, we're tackling a topic that's been widely discussed, but I think rarely understood, and that is the topic of critical theory. I'll speak for myself that I had heard the term, and I had some kind of vague assumptions or ideas in broad strokes about what critical theory is. And maybe you've heard the term too, maybe in connection to critical race theory. But what is critical theory at its core? Where did it come from? And how should Christians think about it? In this episode, I sit down with theologian Bradley Green, and Bradley argues that critical theory isn't just a social framework, but he goes back all the way into the beginnings, the origins of it, and he says it's an alternative theology. It has its own views of reality, origin, sin, and redemption. And so in this conversation, I hope that it will help you understand the roots of critical theory so that you'll be able to understand it, discuss it, and think clearly about it. Think about why it resonates with people today and how the gospel provides a better answer. Here's the discussion. Well, Brad, thanks so much for being a guest on Theology for the People.
Hey, Nick, I'm glad to be here and look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
All right. Could you just take a few minutes to introduce yourself, tell us about your journey in life and ministry up until this point?
Yeah, happy to. So my wife, Di, and I live in Jackson, Tennessee, which is the western part of the state. I teach at Union University, which is a Christian liberal arts college here. We have 3 children, 27, 25, 23. We raised them all here in Jackson. The short version, I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, came to Christ when I was 12 years old, a very radical, real conversion up in Alaska. Ended up going to school in Monroe, Louisiana, played tennis. My faith was strengthened during the college years. I'm 60, like many people my age. I was bumping into C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and the like, the whole world. And my kind of eyes were open to a whole new way of thinking, really. Ended up going to Southern Seminary. I went to Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, which would not really been an evangelical seminary at the time in the late 80s, 90s. I didn't really know what I was walking into. Then did another master's at Southwestern, a PhD at Baylor in Waco, Texas, in theology. And then got in the car expecting our first child. And we were 5 years married by then and came to Jackson to start teaching at Union. And we helped start a classical liberal arts school or a classical Christian school here in Jackson. It's 25 years old. And I'll be headed to Southern Seminary in Louisville to continue teaching there in the area of apologetics, philosophy, theology.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the journey.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. My wife's still with me. We're thankful. We're 33 years of marriage and we're going for it.
Awesome. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I was interested to read your book. It's called What is Critical Theory? A Concise Christian Analysis. And I did get the chance to read quite a bit of it, especially I was just curious myself, good title. Yeah. I want to know what that is as well, because I've heard the term used in different ways, which is something you address right at the beginning. From the outset, you kind of say, okay, many people popularly today have probably heard of critical theory because of critical race theory.
Yes.
But it is important to distinguish those and also to explain what critical theory is. Could you kind of give maybe your thesis of your book in a nutshell quickly, and then we can maybe break some of it down?
Sure. So that's a good idea. Let me give a quick summary, the heart of what I'm trying to argue, then we can linger on what we want to linger on. The big picture is critical theory is a worldview or a set of convictions or a philosophy or a way of thinking about really all things. And I argue that it really is a kind of alternative theology. If you want to say a Christian heresy, that's a little provocative, but it is a kind of alternative worldview that's still fundamentally religious. And so I have 3 main sections before some additional reflections at the end. It has a view of creation, or its metaphysic, its view of reality. It has its view of what's wrong with the world, Christians would call a doctrine of sin. And it has its own view of redemption or history or eschatology, so a view of last things. I group history, redemption, history, eschatology all together. But essentially, I'm arguing that critical theory bumps into, it borrows from, it sometimes perverts certain Christian doctrines, but is doing a kind of theology that's ultimately, I argue, parasitic on the Christian faith, but not particularly satisfying to a historic traditional Christian. That's the short version.
Yeah, one of the first things I read in the book, so this is page 19, I've got it open in front of me, and that is actually what caught my eye so much, was that you said, first of all, you say critical theory is in a sense parasitic on Christianity. I want to know what that means, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
But then you say, it's been said that Marxism is a kind of Christian heresy. And then you say, I suspect the critical theory in its own way is also a kind of Christian heresy. So let's tease that out. You start the book by talking about Marxism. Now I'll just preface you by telling you I lived for over a decade in Hungary, which is very much shaped by Marxism in the 20th century, but by a different, obviously by Leninism Marxism, which is a different thing altogether. And then even the way that it was lived out, I kind of felt like it had, from the little that I understood about Marxism, that it had diverted in large part from Marx's original ideas. So please help me understand, and my listeners, how does Marxism, why begin the book by talking about Marxism? Kind of give us a rundown.
Very good. And again, I'll maybe give a somewhat short version, then we can linger. Is maybe like many people, to back up a bit, I had, 2020 was kind of this, I think folks will write about it for a long time, what happened in 2020 with COVID and the lockdown and George Floyd and BLM, Antifa. And then you kind of throw in the Trump election in 2020. It was just kind of this perfect storm. But even before that, I'd become intrigued by critical race theory, trying to wrap my mind around that. And so I realized, well, there's this older school of thought called the Frankfurt School, sometimes called cultural Marxism, and they call themselves cultural Marxists at times. We'll come back to that. But critical theory is probably the favorite term of self-designation, what they call themselves. And the short version is this, is in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany, a bunch of Marxists, often Jewish Marxists, were frustrated that the communist or Marxist revolution had taken place in Russia, but it had not taken place in Germany. And so if anything would have helped instigate that, they thought, it would have been a cultural military tragedy like World War I. And certainly that should at least spark the revolution, but it didn't. So by the early 20s, these particular Marxists formed the Institute for Social Research there in Frankfurt, Germany. So it's sometimes called the Frankfurt School. And the short version is they said, well, we're still Marxist, but we need to rethink Marxism. So that's why one person who read the book said, you need a short section on what is Marxism to help the readers. That's that 20-page section early on. Because they were Marxist, but frustrated Marxists. Marxist, but saying there had to be something more besides economics that was keeping the revolution from happening. And they saw that largely in cultural terms. That's why the term cultural Marxist. There were certain cultural realities, cultural institutions, particularly the family and the church, that were keeping the revolution from coming about. So these are Marxist, but they are Marxists who are rethinking Marxism because of the ostensible failure of Marxism to not bring about the revolution in the 1920s. And then things only get worse in the 30s with the rise of Nazism. And so many of these critical theorists, again, who were Germans, they fled to the United States. So many were in New York, some in New York, Herbert Marcuse over in California at Cal Berkeley. And so they were escaping Marxism, escaping Nazism. And so Nazism is the bogeyman, or you could use the term fascism. So if you're kind of a traditional American wondering, why are so many people calling this or that person a fascist? Even if someone's not, even if say these certain progressives that we might imagine aren't reading the critical theorists, that's in the air. Even today, I think, I argue in the book, is even if they're not sitting around reading Herbert Marcuse, which can be hard, the tendency to call someone a fascist because they're more conservative or they have a belief in the traditional family, that is straight out of the critical theory playbook. Because they're trying to stop the next Hitler. That's the goal. And so this is why I have a chapter on hate speech, because hate speech laws, as a critical theorist sets this up, were an attempt to stop ideas percolating in a culture that might lead to the next Hitler. So this is why they feel they can justify, people today feel they can maybe justify that hate speech law, because you're actually, in a sense, loving your neighbor by trying to forestall the next fascist, the next Hitler, that kind of thing. So that's a maybe more than a short intro to get us going. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how does cultural Marxism come into play when it comes to critical theory? Like, why is that such a foundational, fundamental part of what critical theory is? And then I guess that leads into the question, well, please tell us, what is critical theory?
Okay. So let's think of critical theory and cultural Marxism as the same stew. Those are just different terms for the same group. But what critical theory is, it is Marxism with a ramping up of the cultural emphases. So for example, it is the case that the critical theorist will see capitalism, the free market, as inherently oppressive. But the critical theorists or the cultural Marxists bring a very interesting slant to that. And so let's say, I don't know your income, you don't know my income, but let's say that you're in the middle somewhere. You're doing okay. Let's say you're married. Let's say you have 2 to 4 children. You're bopping along fine. You can afford a pizza on a Friday night and maybe even have 2 cars, whatever. You're okay. You're in the middle somewhere. The critical theorists are going to say that even though you think you're happy and you think you're satisfied generally in life, that you are being oppressed and manipulated by that capitalist system. But okay, so that's kind of classic Marxism. But what the critical theorists then add to that is that there's this thing called the culture industry. There is pop culture that's dominant, and the critical theorists, if they could see the smartphone today, they would say, see, we're right? See, all your kids are controlled by the smartphone. Now, there's a level of truth there that we should fess up to. But the critical theorists are going to say this culture industry, a favorite term of the critical theorist, is mesmerizes, bewitches, confuses, and it kind of keeps you from seeing your true oppression, that you're being oppressed. Add to that other cultural realities like the family. So let's say, and whether you do or not, just for illustration purposes, let's say you believe in the husband is the head of the wife. Well, that's inherently oppressive, even fascist. And let's say that you go to a church that teaches sexual restraint and even waiting till marriage to engage in sexual activity. Really kind of traditional Christian stuff, nothing really that complicated on traditional Christian terms. The critical theorists are going to say all those are ways that these various institutions are keeping you down and oppressing you and keeping you from reaching your full potential, your full happiness, and from really being free. So in order for you, your children, Nick, to be free, dad has to be kept from teaching them to wait until marriage to engage in sexual intercourse, and certainly can't teach their children that Nick's the head of the wife. And if your youth minister and pastor are doing that same kind of thing, well, that child's just in a whole network of oppression from which they need to be liberated. So those cultural pieces are what kind of stack on to the economic pieces that just contribute to making the revolution hard to bring about. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that helps, or you want to pause there and linger a bit, or I'll just keep going if you like.
Well, let me just ask a question that maybe can direct the flow of the conversation.
Yeah.
So you're obviously using language about oppression and liberation, and these
Yes.
are inherent to Marxism, but please help us understand that paradigm, right? The oppressor, oppression, liberation, theology or idea.
So good, excellent, Nick. You're a good interviewer. Is what the critical theorists are saying is that civilization or society or societal institutions like the family and the church are inherently prohibiting, and they keep people from really being free and happy and to realizing who they are. And so, you and I grew up, I'm 60, I think I'm older than you, certainly, we grew up with terms like sexual liberation or Black liberation or women's liberation or whatever. And that was all Marxist-y kind of stuff, new left Marxist-y kind of stuff. But in a sense, the critical theorists are just old school, hear me correctly, in one school, old school Enlightenment persons. In this sense, what I mean by Enlightenment is, in the Enlightenment, the heart of things is the solitary individual being free and happy. And you and I as Christians, we want people, Rousseau, we want people to be happy. And there's an appropriate kind of freedom that you and I think would probably both say, yeah, we're for that. But in the critical theorist vision, civil government or mom and dad, particularly kind of a traditional patriarchal or headship kind of mom and dad, the church, those are institutions which keep people from truly realizing who they are. See, you and I are going to say that. Are you married, Nick? I'm making an assumption.
Yes,
here.
I am. Yeah, I am.
So you and I are going to say that through X number of years of marriage, we're becoming more the persons we are meant to be. And that relationship has helped us, right? That the reformers, the Puritans, spoke about marriage as a way of sanctification. It's a tool or a means of sanctification, a means of grace in a sense. The critical theorists are going to say, no, all those institutions are what's inhibiting people. And so you've got to remove those. So sometimes attributed to Antonio Gramsci, but really it's got him Rudy Duchka, talks about the long march through the institutions. And the idea was, as long as you have these traditional-minded institutions, you are keeping people oppressed, and the revolution will not happen. You add the culture industry and people being mesmerized by pop culture, well, they're just even more in a fog and less inclined to rebel and revolt and bring about the revolution, which will bring about prosperity and freedom, etc. You and I, as traditional Christians, are saying, well, we think those institutions are what are the gifts of God to help people actually become most fully the persons they ought to become. So whatever my weaknesses as a dad or your weaknesses as a dad, we hopefully have been a net gain in our children's lives to help them grow and mature and be godly men and women. And for their good, we try to translate and communicate the scriptures to their age group and shape them. But in the critical theorist mind, all of that is oppressive, and I am holding that child down. So if you're trying to figure out often in the public school world, why would there be such a passion to keep from telling mom and dad about Johnny's so-called true sexual orientation? Well, it makes total sense given the critical theorist playbook, because for the critical theorist, if Johnny says he's a girl, then for mom and dad to come in and say, hey, we're going to go homeschool for a while, or we're going to go to this, whatever, at least we need to know about that so we can intervene and stop that, right? And kind of help that situation. Well, you are a tool, a fascist tool, if you do that, keeping that child from realizing his or her true potential, true self. And so that might be a way to help us think about this, is institutions and society and family and churches are all antithetical to true individuality, true freedom, true joy.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful in thinking this through. It reminds me a lot of the stuff I've heard on expressive individualism in the
Mhm,
West and the
mhm,
idea of that.
mhm.
And as I'm thinking about Hungary and what I experienced there, it seems that maybe their form of Marxism had to do more with economic liberation, because when
Yes,
it comes to the cultural and societal aspects, Hungary was very much, and during communism particularly, very much opposed to individual expressive belief or individual
yes,
expression. Like, I
yes,
mean,
yeah,
definitely it was frowned upon. Anybody who acted individualistically was tried to be stamped out, which is why it
yes,
seems like this cultural Marxism is, I guess, if you will, a development of Marxism that came about in the West, in the United States, sounds like
yes.
particularly.
Yeah, you're getting it. Yeah. The more I read the critical, so I sat down, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, just began to read this stuff and try to make sense of it. And there's no doubt that there's a deep commitment to the freedom, and happiness of the individual. So well, I think it's Andrew Sandlin who's coined a phrase, libertarian Marxism, and that's counterintuitive as soon as you hear it. But if you kind of think about it for a minute, it actually makes sense. What he's getting after is, I think he's right. What he's getting after is, and I was raised kind of in libertarian circles in my kind of limited government and all this. If the classic libertarian position is you can do whatever you want as long as you don't keep someone else from doing what they want, which if you're going to run society, you can do a lot worse than that. But the Marxist side of that is, in libertarian Marxism, is what if there's an institution like a family or a church that's discouraging some options for that individual? Well, that's where the Marxist stuff comes in. And that's where the critical theorists as libertarian Marxists are saying, we must do all we can to hold down or defeat or remove those cultural Marxists, those cultural institutions which are going to keep that person from realizing their true freedom. So in a perverse, interesting sense, it's still, we might say again, Enlightenment individualism is still modernistic in that sense, and that it's highlighting the centrality of the individual and his or her feelings, his or her beliefs about their deep sexual orientation, etc., and anything, including just family and church, that hinder or discourage certain tracks is inherently oppressive and fascist. So the word fascist is common in the critical theory literature for anyone who's fairly traditional in their morality and their understanding of things, particularly Christian morality.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And so when you use these phrases, like you say that it's parasitic on Christianity,
Yeah,
or that it's a type of Christian heresy, please help
yeah,
us understand
yeah,
what does that mean?
yeah, very good. So this is just, as I read the critical theorist, sometimes when you write a book, you see something, you have a hunch. Then the more you read it, it kind of starts to make sense of what you're studying. And so when I began to read the critical theorist and get into their works, I should say there's four persons I highlight in the book. It's Theodor Adorno, maybe the greatest intellectual of the early generation. Max Horkheimer, not as maybe flashy, but the second director of the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, Germany. Walter Benjamin, who was really a French envoy to Paris, so didn't live there in Frankfurt, but kind of a dispatch to Paris as a writer on behalf of the school. Then Herbert Marcuse, perhaps the most well-known and really a rock star in the 60s. I can tell a story or two as we go there on Herbert Marcuse. But as I began to read these people, I thought, wow, they have a view of the world. They have a view of of a metaphysic. Now they might say, so metaphysics is just the study of reality, one of the three branches of philosophy. Metaphysics is study of reality, epistemology, study of knowledge, and ethics, a study of morality or what is good, right, etc. And so I said, wow, there's kind of a doctrine of creation there. What is the world? What is it like? And so then I realized, wow, the critical theorists have a view of sin. Now, sin is a part of the structures of reality from the beginning, most of the critical theorists. So it's built into the system, and there's a systemic emphasis in critical theory. And the problem is really not the individual. The individual is kind of innocent. So that's a different Christian heresy called Pelagianism, denial of deep, utter, real sinfulness. Mm-hmm. And I realized, there's a doctrine of sin there in a sense. And then the third theme or doctrine is the doctrine of redemption or history or eschatology. Is a number of the theorists will at a number of times use explicit redemption language, particularly Marcuse. And for Marcuse, we need to create a new man. Well, that's Pauline language. We need a new man. Now, what's particularly, I don't say this to be provocative, but what's perverse about Marcuse, I think by far he's the most perverse. I don't say that to be cheeky. He was a perverse man. Mm-hmm. Is he makes the case that to bring about this new man. And so the Marxists talked about we're not here just to understand the world, but to change the world. For Marcuse, that changing of making a new man was to take place through virtually unfettered sexual experience. So if Christians believe in the new man being brought about through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, for Marcuse, it was perverse. It was the new man brought about through sexual experience. So it's parasitic on Christianity in the sense that it still is working in kind of creation, fall, redemption categories, but it's twisting them and perverting them. But I would argue that because all these men were creatures made in God's image, living in God's world, living in under God's rules in a sense, his system, they couldn't help but in a sense bump into their own doctrine of creation, sin, and redemption in their worldview. And so in that sense, it's parasitic. It's using kind of Christian themes, but twisting, corrupting, often even mocking them. But they're kind of still living in God's world, under God's rules, and can't help but in a sense think in almost Christian categories.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Could you just lay out for us very quickly, like, okay, what is their doctrine of creation? Yep. What is their doctrine of sin? And what is the doctrine of salvation?
Sure. So for the theorists, one caveat, Marcuse, he sometimes wants his cake and eat it too, but most of the theorists will say that we come into the world, there hasn't been ever there wasn't a pre-fall era. We come into the world already in a system, particularly with capitalism. It gets worse as the modern age comes along, as industrial revolution and capitalism in particular. But the world's already a world in which as soon as you come into the world, into a family or into other institutions, you're being corrupted by that. So there's never like a Adam who lived before sin, a pre-fall era. So it's their doctrine of creation is what we would call Gnostic. Gnosticism said that the world is inherently bad, stuff is bad, and that's what the critical theorists hold to. So you're already kind of into the doctrine of sin before you start. But in my sin section, I simply highlight that for the critical theorist, again, these institutions corrupt, and I'm an innocent individual in one sense. I'm an innocent individual caught in this systemic reality that I'm stuck, right? I'm stuck and I'm being oppressed. And so the issue is both economic, like classical Marxism, but also cultural, like because they were cultural Marxists, the critical theorists. And so again, the sin or the problem of the culture industry shaping me, my family shaping me, my pastor shaping me, the kind of unspoken assumptions of the culture which keep me from really experiencing all the sexual pleasure I want is all kind of part of my problem in this world. Then redemption is brought about, particularly Marcuse, redemption is brought about through sexual experience. And so Marcuse follows Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud talked about how there's two main principles. There's the pleasure principle, there's the reality principle, which is that in order to have order and in order to have a stable culture, we all have to kind of behave. We don't want to, but we all just kind of agree, okay, we'll behave so we can have some order and it's not utter chaos. Okay, so that's the reality principle. But the second principle Freud talked about was the pleasure principle, and this is largely sexual pleasure. And so we live as individuals these two competing principles. Now this is brilliant if weird. What Marcuse points out is Freud never had a way out of this. So if you've heard the term of a coping mechanism, well, that's Freud. That's Freud just saying, you got the reality principle, you got the pleasure principle. And for Freud, that was largely sexual. And you can never, there's no resolution to it. Marcuse comes along and says, there is a way out of it. Now here, and this is bizarre what he says, Nick. He says, we need to create a new reality principle. So we are going to change the world, Marcuse said. We are going to change the world and create a new reality principle via sexual experience and pleasure. So when we use words like sexual liberation, we're not just kind of we may be being old fogies, but we're not just being kind of old fogies. The critical theorist, at least Marcuse, and some of his pals thought he'd gone a bit radical here, but he's a part of this group. Marcuse is literally saying, you could put it this way, the new creation, the new heavens and earth, the new reality that we need, redemption, is brought about through sex. Mm-hmm. So sexual liberation is actually kind of literal in at least the Marcusean strand of critical theory. There's other things that Walter Benjamin says about the need for a messianic rupture. He uses the term Messiah. So he's kind of maybe as an image bearer seeing the need for a Messiah, maybe, but still so confused. But in general, they hold out for the need of redemption and need for someone to come rescue. At least that's Walter Benjamin. So we need someone to come rescue us. We need a Messiah. So those are the three areas of creation, fall, redemption, where the critical theorist offers something very different from the Christian faith. And my argument is, here's where I'm going with this, is I've benefited from people like James Lindsay, right? Very thoughtful man, very sharp. James was kind of a new atheist, now much more friendly to traditional Christians. I'd love to meet James and sit and have a coffee with him, whatever. But he is saying, in essence, okay, the answer to this, to the critical theorist, is essentially traditional Enlightenment liberalism. And what I'm suggesting is, for the Christian is the only one who has the real answer for the critical theorist, and it's found in the gospel, is the true understanding of the world, creation, the true understanding of what's wrong with us, sin, and the true understanding of redemption, our hope. And so, Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1978, in his commencement address at Harvard, said, what's wrong with us? He goes, well, the answer is not in this or that system, which is what the critical theorists say. The answer lies in the heart. The human heart is depraved and wicked and we need a new heart. So the Christian, benefit from Lindsay. He's brilliant. He's read a ton. But at the end of the day, we need to be more radical. We need to be more critical than the critical theorists. So I argue the critical theorists are not critical enough because they're kind of old school liberals. It ain't going to work. Just to say the system's bad isn't going to work. No, the system's you and me. The system's you and I. I mean, the problem is you and I. We need to be made new persons. And nothing in the critical theorist, and all due respect to James Lindsay, nothing in James Lindsay can give us the answer the gospel can give.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Getting back to your book, one of the things you mentioned is that critical theory is not monolithic. But then also, I think, if I understood correctly, you're saying that there are indeed some things that maybe it gets right. And I'm curious what those are. Like, in what ways is it not monolithic? And
Yeah.
is
Okay.
there anything that it gets right? And how should Christians deal with that?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I may get dinged by that element of the book. I don't know, depending who reads it, whatever. But it's not monolithic in that it's interesting. Even though the critical theorists were Marxist, Marcuse was more happy to be revolutionary, where people like Horkheimer and Adorno, they just kind of like their steak and their high culture and classical music and their wine and just sitting there writing, doing scholarship. And so there is a difference on, hey, there's revolutionary, then there's revolutionary. So there is a difference on the revolutionary zeal. I think what you can learn from the critical theorists is one particular thing would be their emphasis on the culture industry. I think their thesis that many people are so influenced by the dominant culture, they really aren't free in a certain way, right? And so, I think if you could bring the critical theorists into 2026 and see every 12 or 15 or 16-year-old or younger on their cell phones all the time and totally shaped by the latest thing on whatever social media app they're using, they would say, see, we told you so. This is capitalism unleashed, whatever. Now, I'm a free market guy. I'm not the least bit anti-free market, whatever. But there is a forerunner in more conservative circles. So Richard Weaver, whose classic book Ideas Have Consequences, back in 1948, 47, he has a whole chapter, The Great Stereopticon, on the influence of mass culture. So he, from a conservative perspective, is emphasizing that culture really can dull the mind. It can dull the spirit, and it can become so significant that your attention span decreases. And even secularists are finding this today. Even some European countries, I mean, good night, Europe, some European countries are apparently taking some sort of initiative to decrease the role of social media in the lives of their young people. So I think we can learn at least one thing from the critical theorist is culture is not neutral, and culture is a way of shaping you, and you should find ways to fight for your own soul so you're not always dominated by the dominant culture. So whether it's internet fast or tech fast or whatever. So that's one point I think we can at least learn. They were right on that part in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, just kind of like tying that together with James K. Smith. I'm sure you're familiar with his work on cultural liturgies, and him really shining a light on that. And essentially you're saying that even before he pointed that out, right, some of these people from a secular perspective are doing the same. So I think that's something we all viscerally feel, though, in our day and age. That
no, it's I think and so I think James K. Smith is right there. And he's being kind of fun and provocative. You walk into a mall and you've got your liturgy and your sacraments and your worship. And so now that's John Calvin talked about how man is always worshiping man. I think that's exactly right. Every person is a worshiper who comes into the world, and God's revealing himself to that person all the time. And all persons know God, but suppress that knowledge of God. So we're inherently religious beings in that sense. And I think that's part of the logic of my argument, that the theorists, they weren't just kind of secular folks, theologically, religiously neutral. They were gravitating toward, in a sense, or picking up on, or couldn't help but speak in, to a degree, certain theological categories. They pervert them, they twist them, etc. But we live in God's world, and we play in God's rules, and thus it's not surprising that that when these theorists write, they're bumping into these Christian theological categories.
Yeah. One of the things you say in your book is that you describe critical theory as having its own anti-blasphemy laws. And I'm curious, what are some examples of those?
Okay. So that was a little history of the editing. That was probably the last major chapter I wrote. I'd kind of finished the book, essentially, and realized I really hadn't treated a classic essay by Herbert Marcuse, where he talks about repression, and so that chapter there at the end on my chapter on anti-blasphemy laws is Marcuse has this great chapter on repression, and it's called a critique of pure tolerance, and so he that's the book, and he writes a particular chapter in the book. But what Marcuse says is, and this is that written in the 50s or 60s? I can't. I may be able to look in the book, remember, is that when people use language and people articulate and people speak, we want to allow some kind of freedom, but if they're saying things opposed to, and get this, I'm going to play a word game with you. If it's opposed to freedom and liberty, etc., it needs to be banned. Now, when Marcuse uses the term freedom, liberty, etc., he's generally speaking of the typical progressive left-wing worldview, to just be blunt. And so, because his concern is if we allow people of a more traditional or conservative vision of things to speak, they might persuade people. And if they have some persuasive power, they would, we might have the next Hitler emerge. Because remember, again, like I said at the beginning, Hitler, fascism, Nazism is the bogeyman to all this stuff. It becomes that in the 30s. And so he justifies the use of suppressing or repressing speech and criminalizing certain speech in order to bring about human flourishing and freedom and liberty as he sees it. And so as I read that, I thought, well, that sounds to me, it's kind of the critical theory version of anti-blasphemy laws. So in other words, you're gonna ban certain speech because it violates their view of the gods, right? The gods of progressive liberty or progressive freedom, etc. And so all those words are just code, right? All those words are code, because most conservatives are generally interested in kind of freedom too, right? We're the kind that tend to be the limited government folks, and hey, leave us alone and let us do our thing, essentially. And so as I read that his essay, Repressive Tolerance was the name of the essay, I thought, well, that is kind of a critical theory version of anti-blasphemy laws. You're not allowed to condemn, you're not allowed to speak negatively of the God or gods of the progressive Marxist vision of what is good and true and beautiful, what liberty is according to the Marxist, or what freedom is according to the Marxist, right? So, and we see this happening all the time. So I go through in the book, and a bunch of those examples come from Europe because they're a little bit advanced on us, although we're trying to catch them on these issues. And so you can have this happens, all over the place in Europe, right? If you are saying, just happened in is it Finland? I just read about, where a person has been arrested or it's been criminalized to just basically repeat what the Bible says about homosexual behavior. And that's a kind of anti-blasphemy law, because the new God, or rather than the God of the Bible, is the God of you must give approval to those various lifestyles. So that's kind of what I was doing with that, kind of a little bit of a cheeky chapter, but I thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So one last question I guess I have is, okay, you started out talking about critical race theory, differentiating it from critical theory in general. And so how would you put that concisely? Just because maybe somebody tuned into this just because they're like, oh, is he talking about critical race theory? You're saying, well, critical theories in general, but one of those is critical race theory. So how do those two terms and concepts fit together?
Fair enough. So, I think most of us came into trying to understand these things because critical race theory was on our screens and emails all the time there for a while. Now, so I decided to study the critical theorists, which is the older philosophical, truer to Marxism. The critical race theorists are also generally Marxist, but I decided to focus on the older critical theorists, their version of Marxism. So I would tend to see critical race theory as a certain, if I could kind of draw a family tree, if you kind of got critical theory here, and the critical race theory is just kind of development of it, right? And then maybe the feminist stuff is one development of it, et cetera. So, and I think the critical race theory has its own worldview in a sense. I think it's kind of a weird outgrowth of critical theory. But for the critical race theorists, they're going to tend to be left-wing progressive. No, they're not going to debate that, right? But their thing is really more race. And it's going to be, in one sense, more oppressor-oppressed than even the critical theorist, right? I mean, because for the critical theorist, we're all oppressed, right? We may not know it, and I think the critical theorists would say they're not oppressed because they've come out of their oppression. So the term woke, right, comes from being awakened from out of your consciousness has been raised. So you've come awake out of your slumber. But for the critical race theorists, in a sense, it's more hyper emphasis on race. But they're going to generally pile on with the cultural stuff too, right? You and I, as kind of middle-aged white guys, will have all sorts of problems by being, or you may be younger than middle-aged, but anyway, middle-aged white guys, we will have all sorts of problems, including being white, and including middle classy, whatever, and having traditional views of sexuality, et cetera. So I take critical race theory to be a kind of outgrowth of critical theory, but it kind of metastasizes, it kind of changes, and it evolves, and it's its own thing now. But I highlight in the book Marcuse's student Angela Davis, who is one of his great proteges, certainly ended up becoming quite activist in the Black Power movement, et cetera, and kind of the forerunner to critical race theory.
So when I was in seminary, I remember studying early on just about the history of liberation theologies, and starting in Bolivia with the Latin American liberation theologies, which were highly tied to Marxism, as you mentioned. And so would you say that, liberation theologies are a form of critical theory?
Ultimately, they are linked. So in the book, I go through people like Antonio Gramsci. There's a short section on him. Paulo Freire on pedagogy of the oppressed. So kind of taking critical theory and applying it to schools of education and philosophy of education. Yeah. So the liberation theologians are again often Catholic and coming out of often Central and South America, some Africa now as well, but Central and South America in particular. And so they would be, I would say, kindred spirits with the critical theorist, and probably more traditional Marxist than maybe the critical theorist, and probably some of them not as taken with Marcuse on the sexual stuff, at least in the early days of the liberation theologians. They probably wouldn't be, they might want to dismiss him a bit, but certainly on seeing the world as fundamentally oppressed by capitalism and needing to be released by some sort of centralized power through a revolution or through the state. They would be certainly fellow travelers with the critical theorist on those points, most certainly.
Yeah, got it. Hey, well, thank you so much, Brad, for explaining this. I think this is something where even I remember a couple of years ago doing a question and answer podcast with somebody, and he was asked, do you embrace critical theories? And really, he didn't know what to say, because he said, critical theories are just so hard to understand that it's hard for us to really wrap our minds around it. So I guess I say that to say this, that thank you for helping us wrap our minds around it, because I think you've really kind of given us, the handles to really wrap our minds around what exactly it is and what the Christian response should be.
That means a lot. Now, I hope the book is helpful and that it helps folks to think. And I hope people part of my subversive goal, not really subversive, is I hope Christians will offer a distinctly Christian response to this stuff and think like Christians. So if the book helps to do that, I'll be a very happy fellow. So thanks for including me on your show, Nick. It's been a real joy.
Awesome. So once again, the book is called What is Critical Theory? A Concise Christian Analysis. I think it's needed in our time and our day and age. So thanks so much, Brad.
Thanks, Nick. Take care, my friend.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Theology for the People. If you haven't done so yet, give us a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. Those kinds of reviews really boost us in their algorithms. They help other people find this show so that when other people are looking for answers to the questions they have about theology or wanting to get more informed about such topics, they'll stumble upon this content more easily and more people will benefit. Also, if this benefited you in any way, please share it with somebody you know and pass it on, and that will also help the podcast to grow. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, God bless you.